You do something about 20,000 times a day, every single day of your life. And chances are you completely misunderstand how it actually works.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Right. I mean, you're doing it right now. You're breathing.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. But most of us just think of taking a breath as this, simple mechanical reflex. Like your chest expands, air rushes in, you get the oxygen you need, and you just go about your day.
Which makes sense intuitively, but it's really not the whole picture.
Exactly.
Oh.
So today, we're going to dive deep into a whole stack of anatomical and physiological research to answer one central question for this deep dive. What actually sets the rhythm of your respiration?
It is a phenomenal question because, well, the control of breathing isn't just an isolated muscle movement. It's this highly integrated, immensely complex neural and chemical regulatory system.
Like a machine.
Yeah, a very precise machine. And its primary job is not what most people think. It's actually designed to defend a very specific biological target.
Okay, what kind of target?
So it works constantly to keep the carbon dioxide in your arterial blood near 40 millimeters of mercury and your arterial pH near 7.4.
So it's heavily focused on the chemistry.
Completely. It keeps those numbers within a razor-thin physiological range because, I mean, if your blood becomes too acidic, your cells simply cannot function. They'll shut down.
Wow. I love looking at it this way. It's almost like your body has this highly sophisticated chemical sensing autopilot on a commercial jet or something.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Right, like it's constantly sampling the atmosphere of your blood, making these tiny micro adjustments to your ventilation so you don't even have to think about it.
Exactly. You just cruise along.
But to understand how this autopilot actually works, we first have to dismantle this massive misconception that has been around for, what, over 100 years?
At least 100 years, yeah.
We have to talk about what actually flips the switch to turn that autopilot on.
Right. Because if you ask almost anyone why we breathe, they will tell you it's because the body needs oxygen.
Which feels obvious.
It does. And to be fair, 19th century physiologists assume the exact same thing. It is deeply intuitive. You need oxygen to live. Therefore, a lack of oxygen must be the thing that drives you to take a breath.
Makes total sense.
But for everyday, normal resting breathing, that model is entirely wrong.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the real answer came from this wild experiment in 1905 by a British physiologist, John Scott Haldane.
Yeah, Haldane was brilliant and a bit reckless.
A bit reckless, yeah. He essentially used himself as a human guinea pig.
Which you can't really do these days.
No, definitely not getting that past the ethics board.
Mm-hmm.
But he rigged up this closed bag system where he would breathe his own exhaled air in and out, just rebreathing the same air, while carefully sampling the gas concentrations.
Right.
And what he found completely flipped the script, didn't it?
It was a massive paradigm shift. I mean, Haldane proved that carbon dioxide and the resulting acidity or pH of the blood that is the dominant everyday stimulus for breathing.
Not oxygen.
Not oxygen. When he breathed into that bag, he found that if his carbon dioxide levels rose by a minuscule amount, like less than 0.5%, his ventilation rate roughly doubled.
0.5%.
Yeah, his body practically panicked over a tiny rise in CO2. But his oxygen levels, they had to plummet drastically before his body even registered a problem.
Wait, hold on. If oxygen isn't the main driver, what is actually happening when you try to hold your breath underwater?
Oh, this is the perfect real-world application of this.
Because I think everyone assumes that, that burning sensation in your chest, that absolute panic, is your body screaming that it's running out of oxygen.
Yeah, that's what we all feel. But that burning urge you feel to break the surface and gasp for air, that is your carbon dioxide alarm going off, not an oxygen alarm.
Oh, wow.
Your body is shouting that CO2 is building up. And misunderstanding this leads to a very dangerous phenomenon known as shallow water blackout.
Right.
Which is tragically common among free divers and swimmers.
Yeah, because people think they can cheat the system. I remember doing this as a kid at the pool. You hyperventilate before you dive.
Exactly.
You take a bunch of rapid, deep breaths, thinking you're, storing up extra oxygen in your blood so you can stay under longer.
But the thing is, you aren't storing extra oxygen at all. Your red blood cells, your hemoglobin, they're already almost fully saturated with oxygen during normal resting breathing.
Like a sponge that's already full.
Exactly. You can't pack more in. So what hyperventilating actually does is aggressively blow off carbon dioxide. It artificially lowers your CO2 levels well below normal before you ever even go underwater.
So you start your swim with this unnaturally low amount of CO2.
Exactly. And while you are swimming, you're burning oxygen. Your oxygen levels are steadily dropping, dropping, dropping.
Right.
But because you started with artificially low CO2, it takes much longer for the CO2 to build back up to the threshold that triggers the alarm.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, the swimmer simply passes out because their oxygen falls to a critically low, life-threatening level before they ever feel the natural burning urge to breathe.
That is terrifying.
It is. The smoke detector never goes off because you cleared out all the smoke right before the fire started.
That is such a good way to put it. It perfectly illustrates how the system is wired. So the body is essentially terrified of carbon dioxide. But how does it actually know the CO2 levels are rising? Like, where are the smoke detectors actually located in our biology?
Okay, so the primary smoke detectors are called central chemoreceptors, and they are located deep inside your brainstem, right on the ventral surface of the medulla.
Yeah.
But here is the really brilliant part of the engineering. They don't actually read the carbon dioxide in your blood directly.
Wait, they don't?
No. Instead, they sense the pH, the acidity of your cerebrospinal fluid, that clear fluid that surrounds and protects your brain and spinal cord.
Oh, that's fascinating. But why the cerebrospinal fluid? I mean, why wouldn't the brain just measure the blood itself?
Because of the blood-brain barrier, the brain is incredibly picky about what it lets in.
Right, it's highly guarded.
Very. So charged ions in your blood, like hydrogen or bicarbonate, they cannot easily cross that protective barrier. But carbon dioxide is a gas. It slips right through the barrier like a ghost through a wall.
Just drifts right in?
Yep. And once that CO2 crosses from the blood into the cerebrospinal fluid, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid.
Which changes the pH.
Immediately, that carbonic acid drops the pH of the fluid. And the brain fluid is exquisitely sensitive to these changes. Those central chemoreceptors pick up that drop in pH instantly.
So the brain is basically tasting its own bathwater to see if it's too acidic.
That is exactly what it's doing. And that central mechanism alone handles about 70 to 80% of your body's daily response to rising CO2.
Okay, but what if oxygen does get critically low? Say you're choking or you're at a super high altitude. Is there no alarm for oxygen at all?
There is, thankfully. It serves as our emergency backup system. These are called the peripheral chemoreceptors.
Peripheral, meaning outside the brain.
Right. Unlike the primary sensors in the brainstem, these are strategically placed outside the central nervous system, specifically in the carotid bodies in your neck and the aortic bodies right near your heart.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the way we discovered this backup system in the neck is straight out of a mad scientist movie.
Oh, the Hayman's experiments.
Yes. In the 1920s, this Belgian physiologist named Corné Haymans did these ingenious, incredibly complex cross-circulation experiments.
Yeah, they were wild.
Imagine taking two anesthetized dogs. Haymans surgically wired the blood vessels so that the head of dog A was being supplied by the blood from the body of dog B.
It was a surgical masterpiece for the time. I mean, to pull that off in the 1920s.
Right, so by crossing the blood supplies, Haymans created a scenario where dog A's brain was receiving one type of blood, but the carotid region in dog A's neck was being fed by a completely different blood supply from dog B. So he could change the oxygen levels in dog B and watch how dog A's breathing reacted, effectively proving that the neck had its own independent sensors.
And that is exactly what happened. He conclusively proved that these peripheral sensors at the carotid bifurcation act entirely on their own to detect blood chemistry.
Independent of the brain's blood.
Yes. And importantly, these sensors in the neck are the body's only real-time monitors for low arterial oxygen. If your oxygen falls below roughly 60 millimeters of mercury, which is quite low, these cells fire off a massive, rapid signal to increase your ventilation.
It's the emergency backup generator kicking in.
Exactly. And, fun fact, this actually won the 1938 Nobel Prize.
Haymans won the Nobel Prize for this,
Right.
which is rare for respiratory research, right?
Very rare. It was a huge deal.
But speaking of these peripheral oxygen sensors, I have to ask about a practical medical scenario. Because if these sensors in our neck are our emergency backup for low oxygen, is that why I've heard that you shouldn't give patients with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, too much oxygen in the hospital? People always say if you give them pure oxygen, you'll knock out their hypoxic drive and they'll just stop breathing.
Yeah, that is one of the most classic medical oversimplifications out there, and it has persisted for decades.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The old teaching was exactly what you just described. Because COPD patients have damaged lungs, they chronically retain CO2. So the theory was that their brains just get numb to the high CO2, and their primary alarm shuts off.
So they only breathe because of the neck sensors.
Right. The theory went that they only breathe because their neck sensors detect low oxygen. If you give them high-flow oxygen, you switch off that backup drive and they simply stop breathing.
But that's not the whole story. I mean, it sounds so logical.
It does sound logical, but the human body is rarely that simple. Now, the clinical caution is totally valid. Giving too much oxygen to certain COPD patients can dangerously worsen their CO2 retention.
Okay, so it does happen.
It does happen, but it isn't simply because you switched off their urge to breathe. It actually has much more to do with complex lung mechanics. It involves something called ventilation-perfusion mismatching.
Whoa, stop right there. Ventilation-perfusion mismatching. That is a mouthful. What does that actually mean for the air inside my lungs?
Okay, think of your lungs like a highway system. Some roads are well ventilated with air, and some are blocked up because of the COPD.
Got it.
Your body is usually very smart. It constricts blood vessels around the blocked roads and redirects blood flow only to the good roads where there is plenty of oxygen. This is the efficient matching of ventilation, the air, to perfusion the blood flow.
Okay, that makes sense. It bypasses the traffic jams.
Exactly. But when you flood the lungs with pure medical-grade oxygen, the body gets confused.
Yeah.
It senses abundant oxygen everywhere, so it opens up all the blood vessels, even the ones leading to the blocked, damaged parts of the lung.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The blood rushes in, but because those areas are structurally damaged, the blood can't effectively offload its carbon dioxide.
So you get a traffic jam.
You get a huge traffic jam. The CO2 gets trapped and builds up in the bloodstream. Add in some complex chemistry, the Haldane effect, where oxygen physically displaces CO2 from red blood cells and the patient's CO2 levels spike dangerously.
Whoa.
So the danger is very real, but it's a mechanical and chemical traffic jam. It's not just the brain magically forgetting to breathe.
All right, so the alarms are ringing. The brain fluid knows it's too acidic. The neck sensors know oxygen is low. But the brain doesn't have lungs. How does a chemical alarm bell in the neck actually translate into a physical, mechanical muscle contraction in your chest? Like, what is the actual biological metronome that beats the drum?
The hunt for that anatomical metronome took over a century. I mean, for the longest time, medicine taught this very mechanical, almost hydraulic model.
Like literal pumps.
Kind of, yeah. Starting with guys like Ligalois in 1812 and Lumsden in the 1920s doing these staged brainstem transections in cats. Yeah, pretty brutal. But the textbooks eventually said you had an inspiratory center and an expiratory center that just looped signals back and forth in the medulla, coordinated by a pneumotaxic center in the pons.
Very mechanical.
Very. But what's fascinating here is how recently this model was overturned. In 1991, everything changed.
Wait, 1991? That is so recent.
I know. Jeffrey Smith, Jack Feldman, and their colleagues at UCLA published a landmark paper. They identified a tiny, discrete cluster of a few thousand neurons deep in the ventrolateral medulla. They called it the pre-Butzinger complex.
The pre-Butzinger complex. It sounds like a secret society.
It essentially is the secret society that keeps you alive.
Wow.
They found that this tiny neural network is capable of generating rhythmic bursting activity completely on its own. Even if you isolate this tiny slice of tissue in a petri dish, those neurons just keep firing in a rhythmic breathing pattern.
You just keep going.
Yeah. Breathing rhythm isn't just a chain of sensory reflexes. It has a true intrinsic pacemaker.
It is literally like the lead drummer of a band. The pre-Butzinger complex is sitting in the back, setting that foundational beat. Boom, boom, boom.
And the rest of the brainstem acts like the rest of the band. You have regions like the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, taking in the sensory signals from your neck and your lungs to adjust the inspiratory drive.
So adjusting the volume of the breath.
Exactly. And the ventral respiratory group handles active expiration. Meanwhile, you have the pons higher up in the brainstem acting like a conductor, fine-tuning the sheet music.
Okay, how so?
Well, for example, the pons processes mechanical reflexes, like the Herringbroyer inflation reflex.
Herringbroyer, what does that one do?
So you have stretch receptors in the smooth muscle of your airways. When your lungs inflate, these receptors send a signal up to the brainstem saying, okay, we are full, you can terminate the breath now.
Oh, so it physically prevents you from overinflating and just popping your lungs.
Exactly. It's incredibly important for newborns taking their first breaths, though it plays a bit less of a role in normal resting adults.
Now, is the science entirely settled on this? Like, is this pre-butt singer drummer the only one keeping time?
While science is rarely completely settled, there is an active ongoing debate among researchers, like Eugene Natty and Patrice Gayonnet, investigating whether there might be a second oscillator, a second drummer, located nearby.
Another drummer.
Yeah, maybe the parafacial respiratory group. The theory is that everyday resting breathing is mostly active inspiration, your diaphragm pulls down, and then passive relaxation, like letting go of a rubber band.
Just breathing out naturally.
Right. But during high physiological demand, like heavy exercise, you need active, forceful expiration to push the air out quickly. So this second oscillator might kick in specifically to drive that forced, heavy breathing.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've established this incredible automatic machinery in the brainstem. But if this is all an automatic unconscious survival loop, how am I talking to you right now?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, how can I just decide to hold my breath to swim or blow out a candle?
It's a crucial distinction. Breathing is remarkably unique because it is under dual control. It is one of the very few vital bodily functions that bridges the primitive autonomic nervous system and your conscious thinking brain.
Right.
Voluntary breathing, like talking, singing, or holding your breath, is driven by descending signals from your motor cortex, the conscious part of your brain, via the corticospinal tract.
Okay.
But automatic breathing, the autopilot that keeps you alive while you sleep, generates from the brainstem using separate reticulospinal pathways.
So there is literally a conscious cable and an automatic cable.
Precisely. And we know there are distinct anatomical cables because of one of the most haunting clinical realities in all of medicine.
So what does this all mean in reality?
There is a rare genetic condition called congenital central hypoventilation syndrome, or CCHS.
Historically, it was known by this deeply poetic and honestly tragic nickname, Ondine's Curse, named after a myth where a mortal is cursed so that if he ever falls asleep, his body will forget to breathe. What exactly is broken in the brain of someone born with this condition?
In CCHS, it's often tied to a mutation in the PHOX2B gene, and it disrupts the development of that automatic brainstem network. But the conscious cable is perfectly fine.
Oh, wow.
So an individual with CCHS will breathe perfectly well while they are awake and conscious. They are using their behavioral voluntary pathways.
Right.
But the moment they fall asleep and the conscious brain powers down to hand the controls over to the automatic autopilot, the system fails. The autopilot isn't wired properly.
So they just stop breathing.
They simply stop breathing. They require mechanical ventilation to survive the night. It tragically illustrates just how physically separate those two pathways really are.
And this reliance on the chemical autopilot, I mean, it makes us incredibly vulnerable, doesn't it? This isn't just about rare genetic conditions. This dual system architecture is sitting at the very center of several massive modern health crises.
It absolutely is. The opioid epidemic is a devastating example of this.
Because of how it affects the brainstem.
Right. Opioids are so lethal in overdoses, specifically because they suppress the brainstem sensitivity to rising carbon dioxide. They effectively blind the chemical autopilot.
So the smoke detector gets unplugged.
Exactly. The CO2 levels rise, the blood turns dangerously acidic, but the central chemoreceptors are suppressed by the drug.
So the body never feels the urge to breathe, even as CO2 spikes to lethal levels.
Right. The natural alarm is physically silenced, so the drive to breathe never kicks in. And we also see this vulnerability being studied in relation to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS.
Oh, really?
Yeah, researchers like George Richardson are looking closely at the central chemoreceptors, specifically the serotonin network in the medullary raphe.
What does serotonin do there?
Serotonin acts as a crucial messenger for these CO2 alarms. If an infant is sleeping face down and accidentally rebreathing their own exhaled air, their CO2 rises. A healthy brainstem triggers a gasp and forces the baby to wake up and move their head.
But if the network is impaired,
If that diffuse serotonergic network is impaired or developmentally delayed, the alarm fails to ring.
this entire disconnect between sensing oxygen and sensing CO2, it perfectly explains what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, doesn't it? Doctors were seeing what they called happy hypoxia.
No, it is a textbook example of our physiology at work.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, happy hypoxia or silent hypoxia was just baffling to emergency room doctors at first. You had COVID patients arriving at hospitals with oxygen saturations so dangerously low they should have been unconscious or gasping for air.
Yeah,
Yet they were sitting up, texting on their phones, and they didn't feel breathless at all. No dyspnea.
because their CO2 levels were fine.
Right.
The virus was damaging the lungs and blocking oxygen from getting in, but carbon dioxide is a gas that diffuses so easily that it was still successfully escaping their blood when they exhaled.
Wow.
And because our primary urge to breathe comes from CO2, their brains didn't trigger the panic response. They had absolutely no idea they were suffocating.
Exactly. It just highlights how entirely differently our bodies process those two gases.
It does, and we see a similar, though healthy, adaptation at extreme high altitudes.
Right. Like mountaineers.
Yeah. When lowlanders travel to high altitudes, the thin air triggers those emergency neck sensors, the peripheral ones, and we start hyperventilating and panicking. But long-term, high-altitude native populations, like Sherpas in the Himalayas, have biologically adapted over generations.
So that they don't panic.
No, studies show their peripheral sensors are actually less reactive to the low oxygen. They develop a blunted hypoxic ventilatory response.
Interesting.
Yeah, it changes their entire ventilatory strategy so they can survive efficiently at altitude without constantly hyperventilating.
It is just incredible. I mean, we started this deep dive with John Scott Haldane breathing into a bag in 1905, proving that it is actually the acidity of our blood that acts as the master regulator of our everyday rhythm.
And not oxygen.
Right, not oxygen. And we trace the anatomy from those chemical smoke detectors in our brain fluid down to the discovery of the pre-Bötzinger tremor in a petri dish in 1991. The machinery keeping us alive is this brilliantly distributed network of separate cables and redundant alarms.
It is, but this raises an important question. It leaves us with a profound philosophical thought to mull over.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we noted that breathing sits at the unique intersection of the primitive autonomic nervous system and the conscious motor cortex.
Yes, the dual control.
Right. You can't just decide to stop your heart or, pause your digestion, but you can consciously override your breath.
Right. It's the only autonomic function we can actively, voluntarily hijack.
Exactly. So if our internal chemical alarms and our emotional states drive our automatic breathing rate, making us breathe fast when we are panicked, can our conscious, voluntary breathing rate artificially rewrite our emotional and chemical alarms?
Oh, wait, like working backwards?
Yes. If you are in a state of high stress and you use your conscious cable to force a slow, deep breath, do you physically hack the pre-Bötzinger complex?
Wow.
Does manually slowing the drumbeat send a reverse signal up to the brain's survival centers, convincing the amygdala that you are safe?
Hacking the biological metronome to calm the mind. If the body can drive the mind can drive the body.
Exactly.
Like a profound bridge between raw anatomy and human psychology. Think about that the next time you take a slow, deep breath.
It really makes you appreciate it.
It definitely does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery inside your chest. Keep questioning the amazing systems inside you. Keep learning, and we will catch you next time.